Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting a simple starry night sky scene from a pine forest, and I'm going to get right into it by masking the edges of my paper. Today I'm using my washi tape, but you can also just use masking tape. I'm not going to be sketching anything underneath, so let's get straight to the colors. Firstly, I'll be using Quin Red by Daniel Smith, Lamp Black by Daniel Smith, Graphite Grey by Daniel Smith, Ultramarine Finest by Schmincke, Indigo by Schmincke, and Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. Let's begin to paint. I'm going to start by using 3 colors to paint the sky. You can only see 2 here, but I'll be using the Indigo, Ultramarine Finest, and Graphite Grey. The Graphite Grey is the darkest and the most muted. Then you have the Indigo, which is like a dark blue, and Ultramarine Finest has the highest saturation. I've mixed the 3 colors on my palette, and around the edges there's more Graphite Grey in the ratio. Then as I slowly get to the center, I added more Indigo, and for the center to be the lightest color, which has more Ultramarine Finest. I'm also going to be using a lighter load and also a lighter consistency for the center, so I can paint the line of stars later on. You can see that I painted straight on dry paper instead of a wet paper because I'm using quite a heavy load as I paint, so I feel like the paint will flow into each other just fine. But if you feel like you won't be able to apply the paint fast enough, you can also wet the paper first, but I feel like the color will be a bit lighter as it dries since it has a higher ratio of water, and you might just need to layer a bit more to get to the saturation that you're looking for, which is also an option. As you can see here, I want the sky to have a slightly diagonal composition by taking off some of the paint using a clean dry brush or tissue around the center diagonally for a bit of movement to the sky to also represent some clouds. Meanwhile, I'm adding more of the darker values around the edges to build more contrast in value. You can see that as the paint is starting to dry off, the paint looks a bit more streaky. This is because I'm using hot press paper and the edges tend to be more defined, so I would suggest for you to use cold press for an easier application. But once I'm done here, I'm just going to dry it off completely before layering on more paint. After I dried it off, I can see that the color is a bit too muted compared to what I visualized in my head, so I'm going to increase the saturation by glazing more Ultramarine Finest over the whole area, especially around the edges. And just like before, since I want the center to be a bit lighter, sometimes I like to take off some paint, either using a clean dry brush or tissue. I'm starting to feel like this has better contrast after I keep adding more paint around the corners and also smoothing out the edges as I go. Once I'm happy with how the sky looks, I'm going to add the stars by splattering some bleed proof white. I added quite a bit of water until the consistency is light enough to make the splatters, and I'm using my smallest brush here, tapping it against my other brush so the droplets won't be too big. Once I have a light distribution, I'm going to use 2 small pieces of paper to cover the top left and the bottom right corner of my page, so the splatters can be a bit heavier near the center or the lighter diagonal areas. I'm moving the paper around to keep the splatters looking organic as well, and after there's a fair bit, I like to also paint on some dots or stars manually while playing with the size of these dots to add more depth. Sometimes I like to even wet the surface very slightly. You might also notice that I didn't use a hairdryer this time, so when I was splattering, some of the areas are still a little bit damp. This is intentional because I want some of those tiny white splatters to bloom ever so slightly outwards, and as it lands on the slightly damp surface, this will help create the different sizes and the depth from the opacity of the white, because the ones which landed on the damp surface will have a lower opacity, which means it'll look a bit more blurry, as the dampness will help spread the paint ever so slightly in a very minimal level. Here I'm drawing out sparkly stars by using some of the larger dots and extending lines going vertically, horizontally, as well as diagonally using my tiny brush. And as you can see, I'm using a very dry brush load, and I've flattened the tip of my brush, then rotating the brush around following the direction of those lines to create the really fine and delicate lines. You can also rotate the paper or the sketchbook so your hands won't need to twist into uncomfortable positions while doing this. For the larger dots, I like to extend the lines a bit further to make bigger stars, and for the smaller dots, I add shorter lines so the stars are a bit smaller. This will also add to the depth of the composition, as the smaller stars will look like they're further away. I want these stars to be the most dense at the center, but I do want to add some which are slightly further away, so I'm just going to keep adding more until I'm happy with the amount. Don't worry too much about adding the stars around the corner because most of those areas will be covered by the trees anyway. I'm just going to add a few more, then I'm going to introduce a different hue to help these stars glow and also to add a bit more interest to the otherwise monochromatic painting. The hue that I decided to pick is this pink color, which is a mixture of Quin Red and Bleed Proof White, or you can also use a very thin consistency of Quin Red to paint over the Bleed Proof White or the stars. And I'm going to paint this around the edges or the lines of those stars, then going back in with a thicker consistency of Bleed Proof White to paint the center, and this will make the stars glow. I only did this to some of the larger stars, and my apologies here, but I didn't realize that my camera wasn't recording, so I'm a few steps ahead, but let me try to explain before I move further. Here I'm starting to paint the tree formation, which is coming from all sides, so the viewpoint is as if you're standing in the middle of a dense pine forest and you're looking up surrounded by these trees framing the starry night sky. The trees are placed radially, so they're all pointing to the center, which helps direct our eyes to the focal point, and you want them to be angled accordingly. So each of those lines are slightly angled to the center, with the lines at the four corners directed diagonally across. I personally painted the lines of the tree trunks using a thin consistency of lamp black to help as guidelines. But if you're not confident with your lines, you can also draw it out with pencil first. Now let me show you what not to do when you're drawing out the lines radially. I know that you can use the corners to direct the lines diagonally. However, be mindful of the lines in between those corners. Make sure that they're also slightly angled, and you can usually tell between the distance of those lines, especially next to the corners. They need to be more or less evenly distributed for it to look radial. As for the pine trees, I like to follow the lines that I already painted with a medium to light consistency of lamp black. Then I paint the branches facing outwards, most of them slightly downwards with a slight curve pointing upwards. Then I paint smaller lines on those side branches in different directions, but mostly outwards. The branches and leaves at the top are much smaller and pointier, and as I'm reaching the bottom, those branches become longer, so the tree has its iconic triangular silhouette. As for the branches, which are facing towards us, I like to still make a slight curve, but much shorter for the foreshorten effect. Then, just like the branches on the sides, I like to add on smaller lines as the leaves. This way you can see that the tree looks a bit more dense as to the tree looking bold if you only draw the side branches. Depending on the look that you're going for, you can choose to use different round brushes to paint the trees. As you guys know, I used this Chinese calligraphy brush when I painted the snowy winter cabin last month. I've had this brush for more than a decade, but I always feel like the bristles are so hard to control because the bristles are quite soft and flimsy. However, after I've painted the cabin painting using this brush, I start to feel like I can control it a bit more, and I actually appreciate the flimsiness because it makes the lines look a little bit more dynamic and unpredictable. And I just find that this is a great way to paint natural textures. I am still trying to get used to this brush, but I do get tired of controlling the tip to paint such a tiny area, since I don't have any smaller size. So sometimes I like to also switch to my size 0 brush to paint the pine trees. Another option is to also use a synthetic round brush like a size 4, like the ones that I usually use for most of my paintings. This would work great because it's quite sturdy and snappy, so it's easier to paint the thin lines for the top part of the pine trees, and you can also put a bit more pressure as you reach the bottom of the trees to cover more area. Because of the sturdiness, it's also a bit easier to control the load and the consistency of your brush. As you can see, when I was painting with the Chinese calligraphy brush, I couldn't really control the consistency. Number one, because the background is quite dark and it's a bit hard to see while the paint is still wet because it's always darker when it's wet. And because the brush was a little bit too big to paint for this size paper, when I clean and load the brush, I end up having a bit more water compared to the paint ratio that I want to, and it's just a little bit harder for me to predict because I'm not used to it, and it's also a bit too big, again, like I said, for this size. So here, as you can see, I've switched back to my small brush after growing tired of using the calligraphy brush. But yeah, I'm just going to fill in the rest of the page with more of the pine trees. I might switch again once my hand is rested, but I just want to try to get used to painting using the calligraphy brush as well, because I feel like it would benefit my landscape paintings in the future. But it's just for personal practice, and it's not necessary to use the calligraphy brush to paint this painting. After I finish painting all of the pine trees and the previous ones have completely dried, you can see that certain areas like the trees on the left have dried a little bit faded and it's a bit too light for my liking. For some of those trees, I like to go over them again, but I'm not going to paint over the whole area. Instead, I'm just going to paint additional details in front of it so it looks a bit more three-dimensional. You can also, however, paint more trees in front of the faded trees or the trees which dried a little bit lighter, and this will add depth to the composition so those lighter trees look like they're positioned further back. I like to also play a little bit with the height of the tree, so sometimes I like to extend the trees upwards so the tree doesn't look like it's standing in a perfect circle. Instead, the placement looks a bit more natural. Okay, after this tree, I think I'm done with the pine trees. It looks quite dense already. So now I'm going to go back to the stars since the trees have covered a lot of it. In the middle, I tried to add a bit more by tapping in more bleed-proof white using a dry brush load so the stars can be very tiny and small. And I like to make the stars a bit more dense, close to the lighter areas of the sky. I like to also add more stars in between the pine trees since I've covered quite a lot of them, and this will just brighten the composition a little bit more. At this point, I felt like I finished the painting, so I just unmasked the sides. After I reveal the painting though, I still feel like I can add a little bit more of the pink hue since it's not totally visible once everything's completely dry. So I decided to go over some of the larger stars again using the mix of Quin Red with a little bit of bleed-proof white. And this time I'm not only painting them on the larger stars, but also on some of the larger dots as well. Again, just like before, I like to also add a thicker consistency of bleed-proof white at the center of those areas that I've painted using the pink mixture. And that's basically it for the final step. This is quite a repetitive painting, so it makes a good exercise and it's also quite relaxing to paint. If you guys enjoyed this tutorial and would like to see more, feel free to subscribe. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!